Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, The Pacific Theater, World War II in Hawaii and Japan. My name's Desiree Littman, and I'm the Program and Marketing Assistant here at Times Journeys. During the next hour, you'll learn more about our tour to Hawaii and Japan, where you'll visit seminal sites of the war, including Hawaii, Hiroshima, and Tokyo, seeing its impact and remnants and hearing from experts on both sides on how the Pacific War changed the world. We'll also hear from Clyde Haberman, a former Times columnist and former Tokyo bureau chief, and the expert joining the tour. Before we begin, why travel with the New York Times? First of all, each of our departures is accompanied by a New York Times journalist or subject matter specialist who will share their insights with you along the way. We offer over 55 itineraries, including land-based trips and specialty cruises on world-renowned cruise lines. We visit diverse destinations that tell a story and explore topics such as history, culture, and politics. Each of our trips offer exclusive access so you can escape the crowds and enjoy access normally closed to the public. I'm now going to give you just a brief overview of the itinerary. This is a 10-day, 9-night tour that begins with your arrival in Honolulu, Hawaii. You'll stay in Hawaii for 4 days, visiting historical sites such as Pearl Harbor and the USS Arizona Memorial. On day 5, you'll travel to Japan, crossing the international date line. Arrive in Hiroshima, Japan on day 6, and spend the next 3 days in Hiroshima and Tokyo, visiting sites important to the war. On day 10, you'll depart on your flights home. Included in the cost of the tour are most of your meals, your tour manager, and local guides and transfers. During the tour, you'll visit historic sites such as Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, which was ground zero for the first atomic bomb. You'll have the chance to explore Yasukuni Shrine, Japan's commemoration of those who died during the war. And you'll visit the UNESCO World Heritage Site of the A-Bomb Dome and the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, where memorials commemorating 20th century service members line the pathway. This is a very unique itinerary and includes many incredible highlights that are sure to make this a memorable experience. During your trip, you'll attend the 76th Pearl Harbor Day commemoration ceremony. You'll visit Ford Island, where you'll see the USS Missouri, the last American battleship ever built and the last to be decommissioned. You'll explore the beautiful island of Miyajima, where you can see the Torii Gate. And you'll attend a welcome dinner with Paul Heinz, who has directed educational programs for Pacific Historic Parks. Paul Heinz will join us during parts of the Hawaii portion of this tour. He has directed educational programs for Pacific Historic Parks with the National Park Service at the World War II Valor in the Pacific National Monument. He has also worked with the University of Hawaii to create educational programs for the East-West Center and the U.S. Department of Defense Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies. I'd now like to introduce you to Clyde Haberman, who is a contributing writer and former columnist at the New York Times. Prior to that, he spent 13 years as a Times foreign correspondent, including 5 years as Tokyo bureau chief. There, he covered such major events as Japan's trade battles with the U.S. and Japan's wrestling with how much of a military power it wished to be. His travels led him to key sites of the war in the Pacific, including reports in Japan from Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Saipan, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Kokura, in addition to Tokyo. Thank you, Clyde, for joining us today.
My pleasure. My contribution to the journey, I think, will be more modern Japan, but perhaps with an emphasis on how World War II, even though it's now 71 years in the past, continues to shape so much of Japanese ways, and also how Japan is regarded by the rest of East Asia It was very striking to me during my 5 years in Japan how the degree to which the war continued to reverberate, whether it involved China or South Korea, the Philippines, other countries in Southeast Asia that Japan had conquered in the lead up to the Pacific War. To some degree, I think Japan was sort of made a piñata, if you will, when it was convenient to some of those countries in terms of its trade dealings with Japan. But there's a lot to discuss on this trip of how Japan's dealing with its wartime legacy compares with, let's say, Germany's. And Germany has been a full-throated penitent for its ample sins. Japan has not been nearly as full-throated. But it is a remarkable country. It always has been. And I hope to explore the many ways in which it is mesmerizing, sometimes exasperating, I confess, but never anything but fascinating.
Thank you, Clyde. I think being there in Japan with you and getting to hear your input on how the war has affected Japan as a modern country is going to be a really special thing.
Good. Thank you.
So let's just go through the itinerary itself. On day 1, you'll arrive in Honolulu, Hawaii, and that evening you'll gather for your welcome dinner with Paul Heinz. Paul Heinz will join us again on day 2, where you'll visit the USS Arizona Memorial and Pearl Harbor. Here you can view historic artifacts. Next, you'll board the Arizona Memorial set above the remains of the battleship, and you'll also get the chance to embark on the USS Bowfin and get a sense of what life was like aboard a World War II era submarine. On day 3, you'll have the very special opportunity to attend the 76th Pearl Harbor Day commemoration ceremony. This ceremony is attended by some survivors of the attack. Afterwards, you'll visit the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, where 74 memorials commemorate service members who have died in the 20th century, including some of those at Pearl Harbor. On day 4, you'll spend the day on Ford Island, again joined by Paul Heinz, where you'll see the battleships, including the USS Missouri, the last American battleship ever built. You'll also visit the Pacific Aviation Museum and see historic footage of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and see World War II era planes up close. On days 5 and 6, you'll travel to Japan, crossing the international date line, and you'll arrive in Hiroshima on the island of Honshu on day 6. The next day, take a tour of Hiroshima, beginning with the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, ground zero for the atomic bomb dropped by the U.S. Later in the day, visit buildings that still bear scars of the bombings, including the Hunkawa Elementary School and the A-Bomb Dome, a UNESCO World Heritage Site less than a football field away from ground zero. Day 8 brings you to Miyajima Island, a sacred island that holds the floating Torii Gate, one of the most photographed sites in Japan, which guards the entrance to the red lacquered Itsukishima Shrine. Explore the picturesque island before departing for Tokyo on the bullet train. In Tokyo, visit the Yasukuni Shrine, then visit Yashukan, a museum that commemorates and documents Japan's wars from a militaristic perspective. Next, you'll visit the War Damages Museum, whose mission it is to promote peace through studying the horrors of war. On day 10, your private coach will transfer you to the airport for your flights home. I'll now just cover off some of the questions we get asked most frequently about our tours. So first of all, is international airfare included? We do not include the cost of international air in our prices, and that's because we found that our guests often prefer to use air miles to purchase their flights, and this allows them the flexibility to do so. What documents will you need for travel? You'll need a valid passport, and the tour operator will assist you with any visas or travel documents you might need. What are the physical requirements of the tour? We recommend that you are able to walk for 3 hours unaided to ensure your enjoyment of the tour. And lastly, what should you pack? Before your departure, you'll be given a detailed packing list that will ensure you have all the necessary items for your trip. So now I'm just going to open up the floor for any questions that you may have. You'll see a little panel where you can type in your questions and we'll be able to answer them. So we just got a question in about how does the expert work with the local guides and what are their roles? So Clyde is there to be the New York Times voice and to share his input and perspective on all the sites you're seeing and all the events you're learning about, while your local guide is really there to tell you the history and facts about everything you're seeing.
Although I should add that I'm not as familiar with some of the sites in Hawaii, although I have been to the Arizona Memorial, but I have certainly been to Hiroshima many times, Tokyo, Lord knows I live there, and can provide insights into other key parts of the war that we won't be visiting, including Okinawa, which I visited several times, and Iwo Jima, which in Japanese means Sulphur Island, and it's very aptly named. It's very difficult to get to, which I assume is one reason it's not on our itinerary. But the sulfur smell is quite powerful and overwhelming in those caves. You walk in and it feels like New York does today in a mid-August day. It is remarkable how Japanese troops dug in those caves for months at a time. I went into some of them and had to leave after 10 minutes. Doesn't speak well for my fortitude, perhaps. But so there'll be insights to other sites of World War II that I think I can provide and would be happy to. For what it's worth, I feel a need to mention that we've begun this seminar, this webinar, at exactly the hour, although it would have been on Japan time, and they're 14 hours ahead of us. At noon on August 15th, 1945, is when Emperor Hirohito went on the air to announce to his people that they have to, in his words, endure the unendurable and surrender to the Americans. To give you an insight into Japanese ways and indirection, the emperor's exact language was that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. You can't get more understated than that for the devastation that was wreaked upon that nation that many would argue brought upon itself. So there's a lot to talk about. Again, World War II as a shaper of modern Japan is continuing, and we'll have lots of things to discuss.
Thank you. So another question we're being asked is, what perspective are we approaching this topic from? Is it more like focused on the American or Japanese perspective? And so we're really trying to emphasize both perspectives to present a really even-handed look at complicated aspects of this war and to give you a really well-rounded experience there. So now I'm just going to ask a few questions for Clyde about his experience. So how do you think the Japanese view of what happened at Hiroshima has evolved over the years?
Oh, it's interesting. I think my opinion is not always very popular. To some degree, this may sound worse than I intended. Japan, to some degree, got a lucky break with Hiroshima in the sense that it allowed the country to emerge from the war considering itself a unique victim. Sometimes I would hear comparisons to the devastation of Europe's Jews by the Nazis. The comparisons are somewhat noxious, frankly, and certainly incorrect. But it is having had the bomb dropped on it. I will not go into the arguments about the benefits or value of the Nagasaki bomb 3 days later, but it continues to shape the psyche of the country, and is an important lesson for, I would argue, the entire world, because quite arguably, at some point, us or the Soviet Union would have used a nuclear weapon in another forum had Hiroshima and Nagasaki not taken place, and because people might not have fully believed the devastating consequences of these terrible weapons. So for Japan, it became a defining characteristic, and it is again something that we can go into much further detail on the journey than we really have time for here. But it is seared into the national consciousness, and certainly those folks who were directly impacted and who survived are fading. There aren't too many left. It is 71 years later, obviously, and I compare it. I compare it, frankly, to the devastation of Tokyo by American bombings in 1945, which was equally devastating. In fact, that more people died on the nights of March 9th and 10th. The night of March 9th into the day of March 10th. More people died that one night and early morning in Tokyo than died several months later on August 6, 1945 at Hiroshima. But people don't usually hear about it, and in Japanese often don't hear about it. There's not even so much as a plaque in Tokyo to the memory of the tens of thousands who died that night in more traditional firebombing. So it's a complicated relationship that Japan has to its sense of itself as a victim. I'm stumbling here only because I want to make sure my words are right, but it's the nuclear bomb gave it a special characteristic that Japan has carried both as a burden and as in a way a shield against further war. So again, we will go into all this at length when we're traveling.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting being there and really seeing what it's like and hearing kind of from both sides. So do you feel that anything has happened or changed following Obama's visit? It was obviously very much talked about.
It's a little hard for me to fully answer because I'm obviously not there right now. I do know, though, that Japanese greatly appreciated the president's visit. Do note that the president did not apologize for the bombing. He expressed sympathy, of course, for the suffering that it caused, but did not apologize for it. And I think historians are still arguing all these years later as to whether or not it was necessary, the bomb, or not. Did it truly save American lives by the tens of thousands, if not even hundreds of thousands? Did it save Japanese lives, potentially by the millions? Because if Japan was prepared to absorb the devastating losses that it did in places like Okinawa and Iwo Jima, what would it have endured to protect the main islands of the homeland? And so the end of the war may have been greatly hastened by these bombs. This, again, is still being argued. There are those who would argue that, frankly, what hastened the end of the war were not the two bombs, which took place on August 6th and August 9th, 1945, but what took place in between. On August 8th, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. And Japan had already had its fights with Russia, its wars with Russia some 50 years earlier. And there is a school of thought which holds that that's what finally pushed the Japanese to surrender. I'm a little undecided myself on which way it goes, but I know people who argue that thesis rather vigorously. But the bombs clearly had an effect, and even then, it still took a full week before Japan actually formally surrendered. So it is not a country that likes to lose, and that is, no country does, but in Japan, it is the notion of surrendering is a particular disgrace. So it has had to unlearn a lot of truths as it was presented to the Japanese people 70 and 80 and 90 years ago.
And do you want to talk a little bit about some perspectives and insights you hope to bring to this trip? Any key points you want to focus on?
Well, we'll be talking about the war a lot, but I do hope, and I assume we're going to be talking about life in Japan. My family and I lived there for 5 years, and I could go on at some length on just endlessly fascinating insights into how Japan works, and it does work. My mother, you always used to say, and maybe many of your mothers did too, that any job worth doing is worth doing well, and that was absolutely embodied in Japan, whether it was the prime minister or the fellow who polished the brass railings at the Mitsukoshi department store. That job was of itself a dignified job and had to be done to the utmost. When I went to Japan as the Times bureau chief there was a very popular song by a country singer with the odd name of Johnny Paycheck, whose big song was "Take This Job and Shove It." I guarantee you Johnny Paycheck was not a big hit in Japan and never would be. The concept of "take this job and shove it" does not exist. And the notion that you can just skate by on a job is non-existent there. And I could give many, many examples. Again, we don't have time here for it of how this worked. It was a remarkable society in that regard. I also learned that as a foreign correspondent, I was a new foreign correspondent then, and I had an early lesson in how you had to train your ears to local stuff very quickly if I could. Japan was in huge trade wars with the U.S., much more intense than what we see now between the U.S. and China. Much more hostile back in those days. I suspect it's because there were still fresh memories among many Americans of World War II. There was a fight over some imports that the United States wanted Japan to accept from the U.S., and I called up a fellow with the trade ministry in Tokyo for how we thought the talks were going, and he said to me that the talks with the Americans were going along parallel lines. The phrase is heikosen in Japanese. And I took that to mean that the talks were heading towards some sort of agreement, because in our use of the phrase parallel lines, it means we're heading in the same direction usually. Well, in Japan, that phrase means the geometrical literalness of it all. Parallel lines, by definition, do not meet, will not meet, ever. And it was an important first lesson of you need to sharpen your ears, son. They may use the same words, but the meanings are different. Of course, that's true in many countries. It's not just a unique Japanese trait, but it is. There are so many insights into Japan that we can explore.
So just to give you a recap, this tour has only one departure, and it's on December 5th, 2017. It is limited to 25 travelers, and this is a 10-day itinerary with a cost of $9,895. There's a single supplement of $1,605 if you're traveling alone, and the cost for internal air is $1,495. If you have any questions or would like to book your spot on this tour, please call our call center at 855-698-7979 or visit the link below to learn more about this itinerary. So with that, a big thanks to Clyde Haberman for joining our webinar today. It was really great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to everyone for listening.